Hopefully everyone can see that as a full screen. Can you just give me a nod, Maya? Yeah, sweet. Cool. Yeah, thank you for the introduction. For those of you that don't know me, most of my work is done in the women's football space at the Phoenix with New Zealand Football, and then some research PhD work, which is really cool. So all kind of interlinks. But something I'm super passionate about is obviously female athlete health, which we did last time for those of you that were here, and then also the nutrition and how that kind of interlinks in terms of prioritizing both health and performance in the women's football space and just the general female athlete space. This presentation will probably be a little bit shorter than the female athlete one. Nutrition can be quite complex, so I've tried to keep it simple and not give too much content because it just gets a little bit overwhelming, but hopefully I can provide you with some of the slides around the content and also some additional stuff post-webinar that might help in terms of specific fueling needs around matches and things and some kind of practical examples. So it might be a little bit less of me talking, but hopefully that leaves a bit more time to kind of ask questions at the end and get engaged where we can. And I might ask for a little bit of audience interaction. So I might put a few questions out, and please, if you can be brave and turn your mic off and answer, that would be really cool to see what you guys already know and then also what we don't know. So yeah, really today it's just kind of nutrition basics, understanding macro and micronutrients, fueling to perform, specifically in a football context, and understanding what the nutritional needs are for a female athlete. Cool. So just to start off, the kind of aims and objectives of this is we want to understand what the importance of nutrition is for general health and performance, understand those basic macro and micronutrients, how to fuel to support training and match play within football. So getting specific within that context, looking at practical examples, so things you guys can take away and apply in your own settings, and then also looking at the hierarchy of nutritional needs and how that plays into your role as a female athlete, specifically around different ages and levels of competitiveness. So to start off, I wanted to put a question out to you guys and ask kind of why nutrition is important. So if someone is willing to turn their mic off and have a go, or maybe throw some ideas out there, it would be really cool just to see what you guys think. And there's no kind of wrong answer. If anyone has anything to say, just jump in. I thought this might be the case. We might be.
Who's going to be brave? Go on, someone's going to be brave. See Kat Kelly or Ivy or Jean or Zara there. Who's going to be brave and say something?
Okay.
I was just going to say hi.
Hi.
Basically, I don't know why nutrition is important beyond the basics.
Yeah.
So I guess that's where I'm coming from.
Cool. Yeah, no, that's cool to know because that gives me a good understanding of where you're at in terms of nutrition and what it means. Does anyone else want to add anything to that? Otherwise, we'll kind of get cracking. We got some shy people on the call today.
It gives us energy.
Yes, great. It gives us energy. That's a really good one. Anyone else want to build on that?
It's an important part of your critical health.
Cool. Yeah, really critical for health. Awesome.
Our bodies use the nutrients so we can play things like sport.
Yeah, so we need those nutrients to kind of for energy requirements so that we can move and perform. Yep, awesome. These are good answers. Does anyone else want to build on it further? Cool. We'll leave it at that. That was actually a really good start. So I guess to define nutrition, it's the process of providing or obtaining food necessary for health and growth. And then it's important for growth and development, which I guess is part of that overarching health, which someone touched on. It's important for energy, which someone else also touched on. And then it's also important for just general regulation of metabolism. So there are 3 major macronutrients that we're going to kind of go through today. And I'm hoping that someone who's on the call at the moment will be able to tell me what those 3 macronutrients are, or at least one of them. Does anyone want to jump in and have a go? Even if you only know one, that's a good start.
Is carbohydrates one?
Perfect. Carbohydrates, 1.
Sugars?
That would kind of be under carbohydrates. So yeah, that is technically correct.
Is
Um,
protein one?
Protein, yep. And then there's one more.
What's a macronutrient?
Calcium?
That's a micronutrient. So that's close. We got one more. See if someone can get it. Fats, perfect. Nice. So 3 macronutrients are carbohydrates, fats, and protein. And then what percentages do we want to be consuming these in? Just as an overarching idea, carbohydrates, we're looking at 45 to 65%. This is going to depend on your daily energy requirements and what you're doing in terms of training. Fats are 10 to 35%, and then protein 20 to 35%. And kind of those percentages will change based on your physical energy demands across the day, but we'll get into that as we go on. So carbohydrates. So what are carbohydrates? Essentially, carbohydrates are the body's primary source of energy, the most preferred source of fuel in terms of trying to meet physical demands, not just physical activity, but also using just your brain and general functioning of the body. They're composed of glucose molecules. So those are kind of like sugar molecules, which someone mentioned. And we have 2 types of carbohydrates. So we have our simple carbohydrates, and these are what we'd call monosaccharides or disaccharides. And that just means they've got 1 or 2 glucose molecules or 1 or 2 sugar molecules. And then complex carbohydrates are polysaccharides, and that's a big chain of glucose molecules all joined together, or a big chain of sugar molecules. So breaking these down, the simple carbohydrates and the complex carbohydrates, simple carbohydrates are digested really quickly and they're transported to the bloodstream for fuel really fast. So this is really good for football context because it allows you to get fuel quickly to help you perform. And it also helps to restock your carbohydrate stores that are in your body faster. So just some examples of what simple carbohydrates might be. There'd be general white flour products. So white bread, white bagels, white pasta, white rice, fruit, obviously still really good for you. All these things can still be good for you, but they just have a lot of sugar in them. So they're easily broken down. And then also processed foods, which would include things like lollies, I guess chocolate, anything like that is going to be really high in simple carbohydrates. And these have their place in a football context, and we'll kind of get into that. And then on the flip side, we have our complex carbohydrates. So these are basically the opposite. They're digested really slowly and transported throughout the body for energy over time. So we call this like slow sustained fuel, and they're generally really good for meeting your daily energy demands. So keeping you fueled and able to perform across a day, not necessarily in an immediate context. And these are mainly found in whole grains and also vegetables. So that's, if you think about like why it takes time to break down, it's because it's got all those chains of glucose. So the body has to break those down for them to then be released to be able to be used as fuel. So a really good visual of the comparison between the two. So this high GI line on the graph is our simple carbohydrate. So you can see that blood glucose, so that's sugar in the bloodstream that's available for energy, spikes really fast, which means we get fuel quickly to perform, compared to the low GI, which are complex carbohydrate, which is well, it's a smaller peak for one, but it's also sustained over a longer period of time. So we're seeing this peak within kind of 15 to 30 minutes, whereas we're getting a peak here, which is only at like half the size or even a third of the size, and that's taking close to 45 minutes, but we have energy for a longer period of time. And so the easiest way to kind of think of like what's simple carbs or what's high GI and low GI is generally your high GI foods are your simple carbs and your low GI are your complex carbs. And then just looking at an example of how much carbohydrate is in different types of foods. So these are kind of common, I guess, carbohydrate dense foods you guys will be consuming across the day. Some of them are complex carbs, some of them are simple carbs. Some of them also are really high in protein and other macronutrients. So say, for example, chickpeas, 21 grams of carbs compared to 35 in pasta, but it has a much higher protein content. in comparison. And sometimes it's actually surprising for something like bread, which I think is demonized somewhat in the media as being really bad for you because it's really high in carbohydrates, actually isn't necessarily that high, but it's also really good in a football context where we are trying to fuel and perform. And then one thing to note in terms of how complex or simple the carbohydrate is generally how processed the food is. So the more processed, the more simple. So say brown rice versus white rice, white rice has had the germ layer removed. And so it's easier for your body to break down. And so you get fuel to the bloodstream quicker as just a general example. So now kind of let's look at the role of carbohydrate in a football context. Before I get into that, does anyone have any questions just generally on carbohydrates, what they are and like how they work in the body? No? Cool. If you do have any, just pop them in the chat and we can always answer them at the end. But in terms of football and carbohydrate, I think it's important to understand what football is in terms of the energy demands and the energy systems being used before we get into the role of carbohydrate. So we know that football is a really high intensity intermittent sport. You have to work to a really high intensity, recover, and then go again. So we know that if you're looking at a 90-minute game, particularly like an international standard, we're going to be running close to 10K per match, 1,400 activity changes. So that's 1,400 different changes of direction, approximately 200 sprints within a game. And they generally are around 40 seconds worth. And then average heart rate actually sits pretty high across a game, and it's around 85% of your maximum. So that's looking around 170 to 180 beats a minute. And then peak heart rates are usually around 98% of max. So we're looking at 190 to 200 beats a minute. And then if we look at the energy demands within a game, so we know just for total calorie requirements for a game, and this is again a 90-minute game, so it may be different depending on how much you're playing, but we're looking at around 1,000 calories, which if we put it into a context, I actually gave this example yesterday, but we're looking at close to 2 rolls of sushi as an example of what that could be for calorie requirements. And then for trainings, we're looking at around a 680, and that would be for a 90-minute training. And that's obviously for a standard 60 kg female, but that's going to vary between individuals. Because it is a high intensity sport, it's very carbohydrate dominant, and we'll get into why that is a bit later. We're just kind of getting the basics. And then also because of the intensity, we now understand that glycogen stores, so the carbohydrate that's stored within your body that you can use for fuel, actually get depleted almost within 45 minutes. So we'll touch on why that's important again a bit later and what we can do about that. And then the other thing to note is that football does induce a significant amount of muscle damage, and that's just because of all the changes of direction and also the high intensity accelerations and decelerations. And this impacts your glycogen restoration. So essentially, because I guess after a game, you try and restock glycogen because of all the muscle damage, it slows this process down. And so we need to make sure we're on top of that in order to prepare for the next game. And this also impacts muscular fatigue. So this is kind of an analogy I like to use for glycogen storage, and you can alternate glycogen with carbohydrate, but essentially just think of it as the carbohydrate that's stored within the muscles from the food that you've previously eaten that you can then use for fuel. So if we look at this dry sponge here, this would be an example of someone that's got a low carbohydrate intake, and so they have low glycogen stores in the body, and the sponge is really dry. So I think there's like kind of nothing to squeeze out because we haven't had that carbohydrate intake. Compared to a high carbohydrate intake, they've got full glycogen stores, the muscles are fully stocked with carbs. And then if you think you go into an intense football match, you can utilize those stores, and that's like kind of you're squeezing out the sponge. You're squeezing out all the carbohydrate and putting that into energy for performance. So essentially, why I wanted to touch on the demands of a football match is because intensity becomes a really important component. So you would, if you remember, your heart rate sits around 85% of its max throughout a match. And then if we look at this graph, this is looking at the utilization of carbohydrate at different intensities of exercise. And you can see that as the exercise intensity increases, and this will be looking at heart rate, and it gets up to close to 75, the amount of carbohydrate that's used relative to fat continues to increase. And once we get to 85%, 90%, 100, you're basically only using carbohydrate. And so the requirements of carbohydrate as a fuel during football are really, really high because that intensity is high. And then the other thing we need to understand is this utilization of carbohydrate as the predominant source of fuel can only be maintained while you have carbohydrate available. And so if you think back to what I said before, where glycogen stores tend to get close to depletion at 45 minutes, that means unless we're ingesting fuel during exercise, so we're consuming some kind of external carbohydrate, we're going to run out of carbohydrates to keep fueling the match. And that means we're going to rely on fats for fuel. If we look at the equations of that, I won't go into detail, but essentially it's a slower process. And so it's going to reduce your ability to perform at the same level and continue to work at an intensity that you required. And so this is kind of an example of, if we think about those two sponges, and we have our low glycogen sponge where we haven't got a lot available, and then our high glycogen sponge or muscles, however you want to think about it, this is where we can squeeze lots out. And so the utilization of carbohydrate increases for fuel compared to where we haven't got a lot and then we're reliant on more fat. And essentially the difference is this person, and if we were to go into the study, we'd be able to see this, but this person is able to perform at a higher level because they're able to use carbohydrate for fuel rather than this person who's actually reliant a little bit more on fat. And so just to kind of go over that, if we go into a match with a low carbohydrate intake, we're not going to have a lot to squeeze out compared to a high glycogen intake or a high carbohydrate intake where we can hold that intensity for longer. And so our example here, having full glycogen stores, we've got a lot to squeeze out and utilize for the match. The other thing that's important to note, and hopefully you also took note of this before in one of the previous slides where I talked about restoration of glycogen stores. And there's one context that this becomes really important in. Maybe I'll put a question out to you in a sec. But essentially, if we think we've got our high carbohydrate intake, we've fueled really well pre-game, we've then done our match, we've squeezed out all that carbohydrate, we then have to increase our carbohydrate intake again post-game in order to, one, recover from the muscle damage, but also restock those glycogen stores so that we can perform again in subsequent trainings and games. Does anyone know where this high carbohydrate intake post-match would become really, really important and really essential? Does anyone want to have a go? I think you might know, or someone might have an idea. And there's no wrong answer. Just give it a go.
Go on, who's gonna be brave? Doesn't have to be the same people again. Do you want to give him a little hint, Izzy?
Yeah, if you think you've got rid of all your carbohydrate stores and you're going to have to perform again really soon, what kind of situation would that be where you need to have those carbohydrates ready to go again? Might be too tricky. Maybe I haven't explained it well enough.
I think some of these girls will be going off to secondary school something next week. It's a good hint.
A tournament.
A tournament. Yeah, so anytime we have back-to-back matches in secondary schools is a really good example because you're having double days. Carbohydrate intake becomes really important because you're constantly just using up all those internal stores, so all the stores in your muscles. And so you have to keep topping it up throughout the day and particularly post-game in order to help your recovery, but also prepare for the next game. So that's a really good example of why you need that carbohydrate intake, not only before, but also afterwards. So just an example of what this could look like. So this is kind of like a game day example that I like to use with the girls at the Phoenix and at New Zealand Football. So as you guys should know now, we want to start in a high glycogen state. So we're trying to consume a high carbohydrate meal 3 to 4 hours before the game. This is just an example, which is some toast with peanut butter, honey, and banana. You're getting the extra carbs even with something like honey, which is really easy to consume, doesn't make you too full. You're then looking at taking on carbohydrate within the game. So we've got things like gels, bananas. You can also have lollies, electrolyte, muesli bars, essentially any simple carbohydrates that you find you can stomach really well. That's really good to take on at halftime, or if you're in a tournament context, maybe between games. We're then looking to refuel with protein and carbohydrates, because we know that carbohydrate also helps with muscle repair. And when we consume carbohydrate and protein together, we actually restock glycogen stores faster as well. And we want to try and do this within 30 minutes to help kind of drop that cortisol and maximize recovery. And then finally, we want to look to replace our energy output with some complex carbohydrates and aiming for around 2 hours, looking for a well-balanced meal. And then these are just kind of how much we want to consume. So prior to a match, we're looking at 70 to 130 grams. Some of the slides post this will give you an idea of what that could look like and some practical examples. 30 to 60 grams an hour within a game. So that's usually one gel, maybe 3 to 4 lollies, a banana, probably 500 mils of electrolyte. That's some examples of what that could be. And then we're looking at 25 to 30 grams of protein with 30 to 60 grams of carbs. It doesn't have to be protein. It could be chocolate milk. It could be yogurt and banana. It could be a sandwich with peanut butter and something else. So there's so many ways you can do that. And it really depends on your preference as an individual. And then post-match, kind of that complex carb, that proper meal, 25 to 30 grams of protein and 60 to 90 grams of carbs. And those carbs might increase if you are in a tournament context where you really want to prioritize refueling for the next day. So just to summarize, for carbohydrates in general and kind of in that football context, the key things is we want to start in a high glycogen state or high carbohydrate state. So that means fueling with carbohydrates before the match and during the match, taking on carbohydrate at halftime, and then refueling with our simple carbs and protein and replacing that energy output kind of within that 2 to 3 hour window. Before we go on to protein, does anyone have any questions around carbohydrate and kind of that fueling to perform?
I've got one question.
Yes.
So most of our girls will be coming from school, straight after school. Is there like a quick and easy snack or something like that? There may be some examples of what you might have straight after school that you can have with you in your lunchbox before training.
Yeah, I think that's kind of when you want those simple carbs, because you're going to be probably training within the next hour, and you also want things that aren't going to kind of upset your stomach. So you want them to be low in fiber. So that's again where simple carbohydrates come in really handy. Off the top of my head, things even just like a muesli bar, banana, those two things together, some yogurt with some berries and other fruit, because you're going to get the carbohydrates in there, maybe some granola, a white sandwich with maybe some jam and peanut butter could be a good example. Even some people like to just have like a little thing of kind of overnight oats with some banana and things kind of in there. Some like oat cookies, essentially anything simple carbohydrate. There's a few examples, but again, I can send out post seminar kind of a few more examples on specifics that you can have. But I think those are very much up to the individual as to what you like to stomach, but you want them to be quick and easy, and you want them to be high in simple carbohydrates would be the key thing there.
Beautiful. Thanks, Izzy.
No worries. Any other questions before we carry on? Cool. So carbohydrates kind of like the key macronutrient I really wanted to touch on today, because I think it has the most impact on performance, and it's something that's often neglected within female athletes. So that's kind of taken up the majority, but we are going to touch on proteins and fats. So what's a protein? A protein is essentially, it's a fundamental component of all body tissues, and its main job is repair and regrowth. We have 20 different amino acids that make up proteins. 11 of these are non-essential and 9 are essential. So there's two different types of protein. So we have complete proteins, and these contain all the essential amino acids. So general example of these are animal-based products, so dairy, meat, eggs, poultry, and actually soy products. And then an incomplete protein, it doesn't contain all those essential amino acids. And generally these are plant-based products, so it'll be your legumes, grains, nuts, seeds, veggies, things like that. How much protein do we need to be eating? I think this is a common question I get from a lot of female athletes, and it's often something females struggle with, is just getting that enough protein and enough protein throughout the day. So the current nutrition guidelines suggest that female athletes should consume 1.2 to 2 grams of protein per kg per day. So for a kind of 650 to 70 kilo athlete, anywhere in that range, you're looking at 72 to 120 grams a day. And I'll give you an example of what kind of different foods and what their protein is in grams to give you an idea of what that could look like. But the big key one around how much protein is that protein post-exercise. So specifically on games and intense sessions or gym sessions where we really want to optimize recovery, 25 to 30 grams of protein within 30 minutes of exercise is key. And then the other thing we want is regular consumption throughout the day. So this is particularly important if you're wanting to make sure you're constantly repairing, but also for anyone wanting to grow muscle or get stronger. The most important thing is that you're, one, eating enough, but two, consuming protein regularly throughout the day and not having periods of time where it's just like highly carbohydrate, unless it's specifically fueling for performance. So that's just an idea of protein content. Again, the easiest way to know if it's complete or incomplete is generally if it's an animal product or not. And we'll kind of touch on whether vegetarian athletes might be missing out on a few things shortly. But yeah, this is just kind of showing how much protein is in different kinds of foods. And you'll see, as an example, 85 grams of chicken compared to half a tin of chickpeas. The protein content is a lot higher.
Hey guys, looks like we just lost Izzy there briefly. I'm sure she'll pop back on as soon as she can. This is a little reminder for us to, like, if you have any questions, now's a good time to jot some down in the chat box or this is like that. I'm sure this is Izzy coming back on now. But yeah, or if it's going too fast or whatever, like, feel free to sing out as well. If you have questions, like, there's no such thing as a silly question. I'd rather you guys understand it really well and be really confident to go forward and make some changes if you feel like that's something you need to do. Julie, is he coming back into the conversation now, or are we still waiting on her?
We're still waiting, I think.
Oh, that's cool. If you were on the previous webinar that we had, so the female athlete health webinar, can you give me a little thumbs up reaction on your phone or on your laptop? Just give us a little thumbs up. Cool. Cool. Nice one. Kai's giving it 2 thumbs up. She must have really liked it. Cool. So it looks like most of us were on that one. I think there's some real big similarities between someone like, obviously we talked a lot around red S and potentially underfueling sometimes, and that's a big thing in women's sport in general, not just women's football, but women's sport is underfueling, particularly at these ages, like the 12 to 17. So for us, hopefully, as we go through it, like, just keep checking in with your own self and your parents and that sort of stuff around you, around like, okay, do I think that I'm fueling enough for performance and enabling me to go and give my best every single week in terms of trainings day on day on day, or games every single week. Sometimes you guys are playing 2 games because you've got school football. Most recently, you might have even been playing 3 because of under 18s. So there's like sometimes a bit of a load that increases, and are we increasing potentially our fuel as the load starts to increase as well? So there's just a couple of things, I guess, just to note as we kind of go forward. For now, just take a minute. I'll just maybe chat and give Izzy a call and just make sure she's coming back on. Take a minute, grab a cup of tea. We'll be back on in a minute. Thanks, guys. And pop any questions that you had down in the chat box.
Back.
Hello?
Hey, sorry, we were just having a wee pause. That's okay. We've got you back on. You're all set again. Do you
Yeah,
wanna-
that's it. How much did you miss? Just to
probably quite a bit. I actually missed where I just started talking once you'd stopped. So I've actually forgotten where we were up to. Anyone else remember where you were up to? Where Issy was up to, sorry.
are the slides showing now?
No.
No.
Oh, okay. Cool.
We're talking about chickpeas, I think was the last time. Last thing.
Chickpeas. Okay.
Yeah, and vegetarians and
Cool. Can you see the slides now?
Yep, but not in full view.
Yeah,
Not
that's
in-
good. I will. That's in full view?
Yep.
Yeah. Sorry, did I just drop off?
You did.
Okay. Okay, that's all good. Here? Were we up to here?
yeah, perfect. Yeah.
Okay, cool. So we'll move on from that slide. Hopefully you heard that slide. Essentially looking at protein content and what it looks like in terms of 25 grams, because that's kind of what we want to be consuming across the day in little portions. I think the example I said before, which no one would have heard, but essentially looking at rice or beans in comparison to tuna or chicken, you've got to consume a lot more in order to get that protein content. And so it's sometimes about combining the two in order to still get that, particularly as vegetarian and vegan athletes. So aiming for 3 to 5 servings of these a day to kind of hit that protein goal. And then just an example of what that looks like across the day. I guess, again, aiming for like 15 to 25 grams of protein at each meal or each snack. So an example here, we've got eggs on toast for breakfast, tuna and crackers. We've got a more vegetarian, vegan option at lunch with like rice and beans. So that's where we're getting that combination. And then we could up that protein intake a little bit more if we add some yogurt or if we add some cheese, things like that. Snack here, just a Red Joe shake, dinner, chicken, pasta, and then yogurt. So just an example of what you could consume across the day in order to kind of meet those protein requirements. Any questions on that before we move on to fats?
We just got a great question in here, can come in from Sarah.
Yeah.
Do oats protein?
What's that, sorry?
Do oats have protein?
Oats would still have some protein. If you add yogurt or milk, that's going to up the protein intake a lot more, or even peanut butter or other nut butters, but they are predominantly carbohydrate.
Thank you.
No worries.
Thank you, Catalina. We just had a question in here from Sarah. In terms of the averages are for a 60 kg female.
Yeah.
Do you halve it for someone that's like a kid, like an 11-year-old that's 30 kgs? Would you just halve that amount, or is it working in a different math?
No, essentially, I'm pretty sure it would just be half. because you'd just be looking at, say, the 1.2 to 2 grams per kg of body mass. So work in the same way. 1.2 times 30. Yeah, you're going to be looking at like 40 grams. Sorry, I'm just trying to do the maths in my head. Yeah, it should basically be half of it if you were 60 kgs.
Fantastic. Thank you.
No worries. Cool. If there's no other questions, we will move on to fats. So I think this is, again, one that gets a little bit demonized, but people don't understand how essential they are for health and for performance. Their role in hormones and hormonal pathways and the menstrual cycle and reproduction is one thing, but they're also important in protecting your vital organs. They are required for the transport of some vitamins, so vitamin A, D, E, and K. They make up your cell membranes, and then if we think of even a football context, they are an energy source for prolonged exercise. So they have a lot of roles in the body, and they are essential that we consume them. So same as proteins and carbohydrates, we have two different types of fats. We have our saturated fats, which are solid at room temperature. Some examples are just like your red meats, dairy products, things like that. And then your unsaturated fats, which I think we think of more as the healthy fats, where we want to be consuming majority of our fats from these. And these are liquid at room temperature. So your olive oils, your nut butters, avocados, nuts, seeds, things like that. And they're really protective against cardiovascular disease. So an example of what or how much fat different foods would have in them, or some high fat foods. So most of these are unsaturated fats because we predominantly want you to be choosing these. So we're looking at avocado, salmon, almonds, nuts, seeds, all those kind of things. And you can just see kind of the different contents and what those look like. And then more from a visual perspective of what a serving could look like. 80 to 100 grams of salmon, peanut butter, cheese, nuts. So that's kind of what one serving would look like. And then we're looking for 3 to 4 servings per day. So generally trying to add one of these into at least your main meals, or 1 or 2, depending on how much you're doing. One thing to note is if athletes kind of struggle with meeting energy requirements, particularly with fullness, or they're just struggling with low energy availability, or kind of being really lean and struggling to put on muscle or weight, an easy way to increase calories within your diet and increase energies consumption is to increase the amount of fat you're consuming, just because they are quite high in calories, but they won't make you feel full. So I'll touch on it a little bit later, but the biggest thing we want is that you're consuming enough energy to support your energy output. And so if consuming more fats is the easiest way to do it, that would be my recommendation in that sense. And then finally, we just get on to micronutrients. We won't go into too much depth, but just to kind of touch on it. So these are essential compounds that regulate and enhance processes of energy release from food, and they should usually be obtained through food. There are 13 vitamins. They're all available through your diet, except for vitamin D and K. And then 20 different minerals, and these are essential for health and performance. So we know that research in elite athletes show they don't always consume a well-balanced diet, even though you think they would. And so they are actually at quite high risk for nutrient deficiencies, particularly because of the demands of training. And also it can be time consuming to prepare, I guess, well-balanced meals and things like that. So making sure athletes understand what are essential, particularly female athletes, is really important to ensure we are consuming them. So I'm just going to go through a couple of key ones for female athletes. So vitamin D, really important because it has a big role in bone health. It increases calcium absorption, which helps bone turnover and bone remodeling, which we want to be strong in females, particularly because of the decline in bone density post-menopause. It is obtained from sun exposure when you don't have sunscreen on, and so it's important in the winter months if you don't get a lot of sun or the sun's not strong enough, and this is kind of more prevalent in the northern hemisphere, but that you consume a vitamin D supplement if required, just to make sure you're still getting that, because it also plays a role in immune function and reducing risk of upper respiratory infections and colds and things like that. So a really key one to look at, particularly if you don't get a lot of sun exposure. Vitamin B12, this one comes up a lot because vegetarians and vegans often aren't able to consume it through food because it comes from animal type products. It promotes blood cell formation and the maintenance of body tissues, and it also plays a role in immune function. So while most individuals will get it just from their general dietary intake, vegetarian and vegan athletes will likely need to take an external supplement. So if that is you and you haven't done that, then asking your GP could be a good first move in that case. The other one's calcium. Again, really important for bone health, also muscle contraction. For females, we want to look at 1,000 to 1,300 milligrams of calcium per day. And good examples of high calcium foods are your dairy products, egg yolks, dark leafy greens, cauliflower beans, legumes, things like that. The other thing to note is that your absorption of calcium does plateau at 500 milligrams. And so having calcium throughout the day in different meals becomes really important when you're trying to meet those requirements. And then finally, iron. I think that's probably the biggest one, and the one most of you would have heard of is iron deficiency and iron deficiency with anemia. It's really common in female athletes, more prevalent in the general population. Iron's involved in oxygen transport, and so without iron, the oxygen is not transported around the body as well, and so that can cause a reduction in performance and an increase in fatigue. It also affects immune function, so it has a whole host of impacts on performance and health. We know that iron, the bioavailability, so the ability of your body to kind of absorb it and use it from vegetarian foods or athletes consuming a vegetarian diet, is lower. And so paying attention to iron, often through blood tests or monitoring general well-being, is a good first step for vegetarian athletes. The other thing to consider is that if you have heavy menstrual bleeding, you will be losing more iron through blood. And athletes also lose more iron through the pounding of their feet. And so again, it's important to consider whether they are getting enough iron. And I think fatigue and kind of low performance are two really good indicators. And if you are experiencing those, it's important to go and visit your GP and get your iron checked. But the best way to kind of get your iron is those red meats, dark leafy greens, legumes. And again, it is more difficult in vegetarian athletes, but it isn't impossible. So have a look into that. And if you are experiencing those symptoms, then don't hesitate to kind of reach out to your GP and get it checked. And then that's just kind of a summary of all the different vitamins and then all the different minerals. Any questions on that before we move into the final part?
I've just got more of like an example, Izzy, is that like I know when I worked with Vancouver Whitecaps in Canada, like 90% of the athletes that were tested had to take vitamin D supplements because it was that important. And because especially in the winter, they won't get enough sunlight, but like across the whole year, that lasted across the whole year, that vitamin D. So if you feel like you're not potentially getting enough nutrients in certain areas or whatever, there are ways that you can get it without it being like a pill or anything like that. Like it's actually like pretty easy. And same with iron. Like if you feel like you're really low energy, often iron's that way to go in terms of just getting that checked.
Yeah, I doubled down on that with vitamin D and iron as the kind of two key ones. I think New Zealand, it's less likely you're going to be deficient in vitamin D, but it's also still really common. So if you are getting any of those symptoms, don't hesitate to like kind of go check it out. So that was a really good point, Maya. Thanks.
Izzy, a question on the chat. So sorry, Rudy.
Go for it.
Question on the chat that says that we're with the grams that you've given for the the volume of carbohydrate or fats that you need to consume. Is that grams per ideal weight? So if somebody's underweight, should you be basing what they should eat on their ideal weight rather than what they actually weigh, or on? No,
you'd be basing it on your current weight. Yeah.
Easy. Is it true that having vitamin C before eating iron helps the absorption of it more? I heard that.
Consuming it alongside iron does help absorption. So yeah, having your, if you want oranges with your red meat, go for it. But maybe choosing the right vitamin C things that go together. But yes, that is true.
Sweet. Thank you.
No worries. Any other questions before we get on to the last little bit?
there's another one in the chat which says, would you recommend on top of a balanced diet a good multivitamin?
No, I actually wouldn't. I think if you're consuming a well-balanced diet and you're confident in that, you shouldn't need any kind of additional vitamins. If you're not consuming a well-balanced diet, though, then those may come in handy. So yeah, that's kind of up to you. And I guess maybe considering how you're feeling and your well-being in general could be a guideline around that. Cool. If that's it for now, we'll still have some time at the end, but I'll just kind of get into the last little bit before we do run out of time. So here is the hierarchy of nutritional needs, and this was developed specifically for female athletes. I think it was published in 2021, and it kind of looks at what the most important things are from a nutritional perspective and how we kind of layer those on top of each other. So I kind of just wanted to retouch on this one because, as you'll see in the pyramid, I'll just go back. The most important part of the hierarchy of nutritional needs is energy availability. And essentially, if you're not consuming enough energy, none of these are important. So it doesn't matter about your carbohydrate fueling, your protein intake, when you're consuming it, what your macros look like. If you're not consuming enough energy, we're not going to be getting enough energy to support our performance. So that's kind of the number one key thing. So this slide came up in the last presentation when we spoke about low energy availability. But essentially, we want to be aiming for this green. So there's 45 calories per kg of fat-free mass. And for an example of a footballer, that was 3,000 calories daily intake, which the best way to look at that rather than trying to get stuck into the numbers is 4 to 5 meals a day, or 3 to 4 big meals, 2 to 3 snacks spread out across the day, and making sure you're fueling around your training. You're going to be hitting that requirement. So that's kind of the biggest thing. So if we look at that one in a little bit more detail, it's really just about providing enough energy for your exercise, but then the daily functioning of your body. So still being able to go to school, use your brain, focus in school, all your different organs that need to function, repair, regrowth, all those daily processes, plus the energy for exercise. And like I said, that's that kind of 45 calorie number for health, well-being, and performance. And then we know that if we do get below that 30 calories, we are going to kind of be getting into that low energy availability zone. Whilst that isn't quite validated, it is a good kind of marker. But I think the best way to know if you're not meeting those energy requirements is kind of those changes in mood, feeling really fatigued, feeling like your performance is suffering. Some of the things we talked about last time, menstrual irregularities, all of those are really good signs of that you may not be kind of meeting those energy availability requirements. And so you might need to look at how much you're consuming and when you're consuming it across the day. And so just looking at an example of maybe what a footballer could be eating on a daily basis. This is the same example that we had in the protein one, but this time we're just looking at the calorie intake or the energy intake from each meal. And those are kind of what you want to be consuming. So your main meal is like 600 to 700, sometimes even 800 calories. And then those little snacks in between, kind of that 200 to 400 calorie range. Obviously, that will fluctuate based on what you're doing, what your energy output is, but as a good standard kind of guideline, particularly with young growing athletes where your energy requirements are even higher, this is kind of a really good template, and you can just kind of chop and change things. And then the only other one I really wanted to touch on, because we've talked about it today, is those macro and micronutrients. So if you remember from like the third or fourth slide, we said we want to consume 45 to 65% of carbohydrate, 10 to 35% fats, and then 20 to 35%, I've actually got 20 to 35% fat there, and then 20 to 35% protein. Just looking at those daily numbers based on what we've talked about, 1.2 to 2 grams per kg per day of your current weight, 5 to 7 grams per kg per day of carbohydrate, and then 20 to 35% is fats. That is going to look different for everyone. And again, you don't have to be spot on with the numbers. You don't have to look too much into the numbers. Just you can sometimes think of it almost as portions of your plates with those percentages. So that's why I like to give the 45 to 65, 10 to 35, 20 to 35, because you can almost like segment them up and increase your carbohydrate intake when you're doing more and when you really need to fuel and perform. So that's kind of it from me. Just some big major takeaways. I think nutrition is essential for health and performance. It's kind of the number one. Yes, we want you to perform at your best, but we want you to be healthy along the way. We've got our 3 major macronutrients: carbohydrates, proteins, and fats. We kind of went into detail on what those are, why we need them, why they're important, and how much we need to consume. The big one that I'm always going on about in the football contest is that carbohydrate is king. Don't be scared of carbohydrates. They will help you perform better. They will help you recover better. We need to fuel to train and recover. We need to make sure we're getting enough energy to support our training requirements, but also our daily bodily needs. And then nutrition requirements do occur in that hierarchy. We didn't go into it in too much detail, but just understanding that energy availability is kind of the bottom of that pyramid. Once we know that, we're getting into our macro and micronutrients, and then we're getting into our fueling to perform. So remembering the basics first, particularly in this age group where it's a lot of younger athletes that are still growing. And then any questions? I don't know if there's been any added to the chat, but feel free to either type them in there or just unmute and ask.
Cool. I'll kick it off. I've got one question that's come in. How do we know how much glycogen we are consuming? So you kind of have those percentages up or grams of fat. Like, is there an easy way for us to see that we get enough? How do we know how much?
Yeah, sorry. I guess the best way to do it was kind of the examples, and I actually don't know that I had a slide for carbohydrates of what, like, say 30 grams of carbohydrate looks like, but I can send one out post because I think it's a really good idea. And I have a really good one that I use for like pre-fueling because it's kind of simple carbohydrates. But it's hard to think of it in numbers and easier to think of it in like quantities of food. And once you kind of get an idea of what a few things are, it helps kind of you understand whether you're consuming enough for each meal and across the day. So it's not really necessarily a question I can answer specifically, but I think post presentation, if I pass some like slides, kind of some almost posters, we have them up as posters at the Phoenix of like different quantities of carbohydrate and what that looks like visually and practical examples, you'll get a better idea. Yeah, sorry. Hopefully that kind of somewhat answers it. Any other questions? We got one here. If you're injured or sick, would you recommend trying to include more protein in diet to help in recovering? Good question. Sorry, can I just check you can hear me?
We can still hear you.
We can hear you.
You can. Okay. I was just like, no one's talking. Okay. Good question. I would actually say include more carbohydrate because your body will require more energy to recover. But I'm not 100% sure about protein and its role in like sickness, injury. There is studies to show it plays a role. But at this age group, I wouldn't say enough to be like overly investing in including more protein. I would just focus on including a balanced diet and making sure you've also got all your micronutrients in there as well, because they will play a big role. Next question, what would you recommend to take as food to the tournament? Lots of carbohydrates. I would take lots of snacks. I think the biggest thing on tournament is making sure athletes are consuming enough energy across the week because the energy demands are probably like doubled or even tripled. So just making sure there's always food available, athletes are always snacking, taking things on even at half time, and then having those simple carbohydrate foods available. So lollies, fruit, bananas, gels if they want gels, electrolytes, those kind of things that are really easy to consume. And then kind of those meals in the evenings in between, you want like white bread rolls, pasta, things that are easy to eat that everyone likes. It's kind of just make sure athletes are eating enough is the big thing. Last time it was mentioned not to worry too much about healthy food. Too much fiber makes it hard to get enough food in. Any other examples of this? I'm not quite sure about that question. Do you... Louise, do you want to unmute and explain or type I'm not quite sure what you're asking. But yes, I agree with too much fiber can make it hard to get enough food in.
Just
And
what
that would be,
else?
I'm just trying to interpret
Yeah.
this, but I would think a good example of not thinking too much about
Okay, so it looks like Izzy's gone again. I'm just going to try and get it back in straight away if we can. We're almost at time, guys, so we will just try and get it back in one last time. So maybe just bear with us for another minute or two. We've got some really good questions coming into the chats. So yeah, if we have more questions, that's cool too. Yeah.
Sorry, not sure what's going on.
I think Louise is still chatting about her question. Louise, sorry, Louise, do you mind asking that one more time?
I was just wondering what you were maybe thinking that people think is a healthy food that they might be trying to fill themselves up with, but they really should just be not worrying about it. Kind of.
Oh, like an example of a specific food?
Like you mentioned fiber, like what else might people be thinking that they should eat that they could be trying to fill themselves up with, but not actually getting the right things? Or is it just like fibery carbohydrates and the wrong way to go?
Yeah, I mean, I'm just trying to think of an example, maybe like brown rice versus white rice. Like people might be like, it's healthier to eat brown rice, but it's going to fill you up more, so you might not be able to eat as much. Or even brown pasta versus white pasta, or just having like heaps of veggies when maybe we really just need to focus on getting enough carbohydrate in. Is that kind of what you mean?
Yeah, so that's more what you mean, just like filling yourself up too much.
Yeah, like I think it's like if you find fullness is an issue for you and it's causing your energy intake to suffer, or you're not meeting energy requirements, then focus more on consuming things that are easy to eat, simple carbohydrates. They're not going to fill you up as much.
Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Cool.
Thank you.
No worries.
I'm just written in here from an athlete. If you are feeling frequently tired, what should we adjust in our diet?
I think if you're feeling frequently tired, it's a good opportunity to possibly go and get a blood test just to check iron. Like we mentioned, so check all your micronutrients are fine, all your bloods look normal. That would be my first suggestion. And then looking at, do you have a well-balanced diet? Are you consuming all your fruit and veggies? Are you getting all those micronutrients that you need? And then are you fueling well in and around training? So are you consuming enough carbohydrate to support your training? Are you fueling post-training so that you're recovering and then supporting performance in subsequent trainings? And then just daily energy requirements. So there's kind of a couple things there, but the big one would probably be go to your GP and just check there's nothing else going on, and then look at like those kind of overall bigger things.
Got one more in there around, is there good types of carbohydrates versus bad types of carbohydrates?
Yeah, I tried to kind of like slightly touch on that, and that I think simple carbohydrates are seen as bad carbohydrates because you get a spike in blood glucose. And yes, maybe if you were consuming those all day, every day, and all you're consuming is chips, chocolate, and lollies, it wouldn't be a good thing. But I think in the context of an athlete, everything has its place in the diet. We don't really need to group good foods, good carbohydrates, bad carbohydrates. We need those simple carbohydrates because they're going to help you fuel and perform on the field. So we understand that they have their place in football in terms of before a training, before a match, during a match, after a match. Most of the time we want to consume complex carbs so that we're getting our general daily energy requirements, but we need those simple carbs to still be at our best. So hopefully that kind of answers that. I never try and think of it as good and bad.
Thanks, Izzy. I've just got one more last one, if that's okay. Just in my experience, I've had a lot of teammates who kind of get really caught up on the numbers and a bit fixated on when they're trying to figure out how much they're eating and stuff. Do you have any recommendations or just cautionary tales on maybe how to keep a balanced mindset about when we are trying to figure out the portions and things like that we're eating?
Yeah, that's why the question before was quite tricky to answer, of like, how do you know if you're eating enough without going into the numbers? Because I do think you can go down a rabbit hole if you get caught up in the numbers. So I think a lot of the time talking to youth athletes, I try and just talk about it in the number of meals you're consuming and really focus on those 3 to 4 meals and 2 to 3 snacks. I guess also if you can ensure your plate looks balanced and you're like, yeah, a third of my plate is carbohydrates, half of my plate's carbohydrate, whatever that looks like for you based on the day, that's kind of a good way. And then also just, I think you can tell in your general well-being how you're performing, how your body composition is, as to if you're consuming enough or not enough. Those are all kind of good indicators, but I don't think you need to be like, I have to consume this many numbers and then really get stuck in it, because that can, I want to say mess with your head, but just like, it overcomplicates things when it's not that complicated. It's just like, are you consuming the right foods at the right time in the right amounts or enough? And often athletes are under fueling more than over fueling. So that's something to be conscious of as well. But it's a tricky balance. So it's a really good question and something we can't always answer. But I think as you kind of play around with things, you understand what's right for you and how much you need, and you can keep pushing the boundary and seeing if I eat a little bit more here, or I eat a little bit closer here, or whatever, do I actually perform better? If you do, okay, keep doing that, would be kind of my suggestion.
Fantastic. Some really good informative knowledge for us to take on, Izzy, but also some great advice in terms of how to approach the subject sometimes. And it's not easy things to talk about sometimes if you feel like you're under fueling or not getting the right nutrients that you need. We'll certainly be tapping into it a little bit at tournament time and trying to make sure we have really good options, I guess, for players to take on come tournament time. But just want to thank you again, Izzy, for all the information sharing with us and helping us be performing at our peak as athletes. So thank you very much. We will be.
I was just gonna say, I'll try to send through some of those like kind of more practical examples so you can hand those out, and maybe even chuck some up and around springs so that players see it on a regular basis, because that's really helpful, I think.
Yeah, fantastic. We'll try and put some on the walls and that sort of stuff as well. But then we'll obviously send out this recording. So if you've missed something, or you know that you want to pass on to someone else that you think might see it as really important, then feel free to share that recording with someone that you know. But obviously, that goes sending out to the whole wide world. But hugely valuable for us to take on this learning. Thank you, Izzy. And we'll see you guys all soon. Thanks for everyone that's attended. Thanks for everyone that's asked questions and come towards it. And hopefully we'll all take away something from today. So thank you very much. And thank you to Julie for setting up the chat and the Zoom for us today. Thanks very much, everyone. We'll catch you guys on Thursday.
Cool. Thank you. See you later.
Thanks, Izzy. Thanks, Maya.